Well, hey there, folks. It's Dr. Franklin, Assistant Professor in the Department of Psychology at Norfolk State University. And what a dramatic intro we just had. So it's certainly necessary given the subject matter that I'll be discussing today. Today, we'll be talking about religion and spirituality in African Americans. As we address this topic, folks, we're going to talk about it from a historical context, and we'll also talk about what it looks like in contemporary times. As we unpack religion and spirituality, we will explore it from an institutional standpoint, we'll explore it from an emotional standpoint, we'll explore it from a ritualistic standpoint, we'll explore it from an aesthetic standpoint, we'll explore it from a cognitive or an intellectual standpoint, and then finally, we'll consider it from an ethical lens, given that many individuals that are religiously affiliated or spiritually in tune, if you will, not only have a desire to benefit themselves individually or connect with their higher power in an individualistic way, but they also are interested in serving the community around them. So listen, if you're interested in this subject matter, let's get into it. Let me talk about some of the objectives that I have for this particular presentation. So one of the objectives that I have is number one, I want to define religion. What you're going to find is that there are various definitions of religion. Many people have many definitions of religion. So I'll provide a definition of religion that we can work with throughout this presentation. And then shortly after doing that, talk about some characteristics of African religion. It's important to note that there isn't a traditional African religion, although there are similarities across these different religions. So we'll talk about what some of those similarities are. We'll talk about how Christianity was used by slaveholders to oppress many African Americans. So we'll talk about how scriptures were manipulated for the sake of keeping individuals in line. We'll explain factors related to the cultivation of the black church. So it's important for us to explore these antecedents so that we can make a conclusion as to how the black church came to be the way it is now. And then we'll talk about some characteristics of the African American church in a Christian context today. So that'll bring us up to contemporary times. And in doing so, we'll discuss why individuals leave and why individuals elect to stay in the church, given some research. So, what exactly is religion? University of Cambridge scholar John Boker said that we all know what religion is until someone asks us to define it. You know, when most people think about religion, they think that it is based on a belief and obedience to God, or it's somehow dealing with the system of morality. But you know, there are certain major religions, such as Hinduism and Buddhism, that have relatively little teaching about gods. In fact, a few religions have no gods at all. Jainism is an example of this. Jainism is this ancient Indian religion that was established in the 6th century BC. Doesn't really discuss gods a whole lot. And then some people would say that religions look at what is wrong in the world and then provides a set of values to correct what is wrong. So again, it's kind of a system of morality of sorts. Now, sure, the Abrahamic traditions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam all rely on some forms of the Bible. And the caveat to that is that there are different interpretations of what books constitute the Bible, getting back on track. They all rely on some forms of the Bible and have a strong emphasis on a right path of life. Fundamentally, some believe that religions address the thing that's wrong in the world, but there are some religions, such as Shinto, this Japanese religion that started in the 8th century. It incorporates the worship of ancestors and nature spirits. Shinto has very little to do with morality at all. So I ask you again, what is religion? So, as we go a little bit deeper and we strive to understand what exactly religion is, I think it's worthwhile exploring some of the notable definitions of religion. Now, believe me, I agree with you if you're thinking to yourself, man, this isn't so much a definition of religion as much as it is an opinion. I certainly understand where you're coming from, but nevertheless, let's explore this a little bit. Sigmund Freud, typically the psychologist that individuals think about when they think about the scientific study of mental processes, behaviors, and feelings, he said said, an illusion deriving its strength from the fact that it falls within our instinctual desires. That's what religion is. So essentially, Freud is regarding God as an illusion that's based on an infantile need for a powerful father figure. In other words, take into consideration somebody growing up in a household that is not a two-parent one. Maybe they're missing a father, so they create an illusion, a false representation of what reality is as a means to be a panacea for this need, this desire, this craving to have father figure in their life. Interesting conceptualization there. Karl Marx just flat out said that, hey, it's the opiate of the people. In other words, it is a pain reliever. It's helping individuals deal with things that they do not understand, things that they do not know. It's helping individuals deal with the perplexities and the complexities of life and what the afterlife, if they believe in that, will possibly entail. So Karl Marx just flat out says that, hey, it's the drug of the people. And then check out what Thomas Edison just flat out said. He said, man, it's all bunk. It's all rubbish. It's not based on anything concrete or knowable. So these are some of the notable definitions of religion, and it's worth, again, really considering what exactly religion is. So, many definitions abound for religion and spirituality. Let me tackle the terms a little bit more in depth. Religion comes from the Latin word religio, which means good faith ritual, and religio stems from the Latin verb religere, which means to bind or tie fast. So let's put that all together. So religion is a set of beliefs and rituals that binds a community together as they enact or express, right, and pursue what is sacred and ultimate about life. Spirituality stems from the Latin word spiritus, which means spirit. Spirituality has been defined as a belief in a sacred force that exists in everything. So spirituality, to differentiate it from religiosity, spirituality is not dependent on a doctrine. It's not dependent on a culture. It's not dependent on an organization, but it's based on individual belief. So to be spiritual implies existential meaning and values based on factors not tied to the material world or the physical world. When I talk about existential meanings, what am I talking about? I'm talking about things that tackle existential questions, questions dealing with our existence, questions like, why am I here? There's 7 to 8 billion people in the world. Why am I here? What does it mean to be human? What is wrong with the world? I know that you've thought it. You've sat around and you've seen a lot of the calamity, the atrocities, the mishaps that happen in your private world as well as in others. What is wrong with this world? How can it be corrected? Where am I going and where is the world going? Yes, key questions are oftentimes internalized, sometimes expressed by individuals as they interact, and spirituality and religiosity strive to address these questions. Now, religion, spirituality, often used interchangeably, but it's important to note that these are separate constructs. So, many religions don't use the term religion, but instead use faith, as in Christianity, Judaism, and surrender or Islam. Taoism is referred to as the way. Buddhists refer to their religion as a school. Hindus call their religion the eternal teaching. One way to think about religion and spirituality is to consider that, yes, the definitions certainly have overlap, which is what you see in the Venn diagram. And religion is oftentimes used as a means for an individual to attain higher levels of spirituality, but spirituality is not necessarily dependent upon religion. So, all right, Doc, we've defined religion. Why do we even need to study it? After all, the secularization hypothesis states that science and education would diminish or end religion in the modern world. That's what the British philosopher Russell said. He believed that religion will fade away as individuals adopt reason and science as their guidelines. Other views say that religion shouldn't be studied because people should think for themselves. Don't teach it to children. You're going to essentially brainwash them. People think about religious extremism. They point to 9/11, and some point to evolution instead of religion. In other words, I trust in my science more so than I trust in that scripture or that particular doctrine. However, just want to point out a few things. Only 1 out of 8 people in China call themselves atheists, and the Chinese government is bringing back Confucian textbooks to counteract money first mentalities. I'm sure that you know somebody that is all about the ducats. They're all about the money. I get it. I get it. Well, in China, they're trying to counteract that. On another note, many students, approximately 750,000 students a year, take a world religions course of some sort. So, despite the putting forth of the secularization hypothesis, despite all of this modernization we're experiencing, this technological age that we live in that has afforded us this prodigious amount of information at any given moment in time, religion is still strong today, even though science and secularism have become so widespread. 3/4 of the world is religious, and new religious movements are arising every decade. Now, this is all occurring despite people turning away from it due to perceived evils of extremism, despite communist countries trying to suppress it, despite the many changes that have occurred throughout time, despite forms of oppression that use religion as a means of enslavement. Religion is still active and still flourishing. So I'm a psychologist, so I'm going to talk about the psychology of religion, okay? And William James and G. Stanley Hall have been credited for starting the psychological inquiry into religion. But given the rise of behaviorists and Freudians and the fact that most psychologists were not religious and still to this day are not religious, interest in the psychological study of religion diminished in the early to mid 1900s and then began to revive in the latter half of the 20th century in the 1980s. Nevertheless, some foci of the psychology of religion may include the following. Coping with life changes. Okay, so looking at how religion allows individuals to cope with death, cope with new birth, cope with illnesses, cope with changing social relationships and the dynamics associated with it, family decisions, with drug usage, etc. Psychology of religion can certainly involve the study of self as far as conversion, deconversion, religious affiliation versus unaffiliation. There's a considerable amount of literature out there about genetic correlates, and these have been explored, though it's largely believed now that we use many areas of our brain in religious beliefs and experiences. And Hamer is dealing with a whole lot of critics that oppose his theory that the VMAT2 gene predisposes individuals to be spiritual. A lot of scientists are disagreeing with them, given the scant amount of research out there corroborating that proposition. Active brain areas during meditation and prayer. Andrew Newberg is a scholar who specifically takes this neuropsychological approach when looking at religious belief systems. So, the study of religious experiences of individuals and not necessarily religious institutions is argued to be the primary focus of the psychology of religion. In fact, William James, thought to be the founder of psychology in the U.S., believed that studying individuals over beliefs would be the closest thing to a microscope in the mind. Now, I did all of that just to set the stage for the main discussion. I know, but hey, let's get into it now. Let's talk about West African religion. Now, as I begin discussing African religion, let me first say that, again, there is no traditional African religion. Each community has its own system of religious beliefs and practices, and additionally, Western understandings of African religion sometimes lead to stigmatized views and takes African religion out of their historical and cultural context. So, traditionally, African religions has been referred to as primitivism, animism, paganism, and fetishism. So, when European missionaries came to Africa, let it be known they did not need to convince Africans to believe in God or life after death. Okay, so let's move forward. Let's talk about three beliefs that seem to be included in a lot of African religions. One is a belief in a creator who is in control of the universe. Number two is a belief that man's bond to the creator and his latter separation is his own fault. And three, man will attempt to reconcile himself to his creator, and this will lead to his salvation. Now, what you need to understand about African religion is that it permeated every aspect of life, from birth to death, within social, economic, political arenas. Aspects of religion is present. In anything present in life, the spirit world was at work or is at work. And individuals cannot separate themselves from religion. Probably no such thing as atheists or agnostics. So, let's continue to move through some of these things that appear in a lot of African religions. Number one, God is good all the time, baby. I heard you say it in your mind. God is good, and that is seen in the supply of rain for crops, averting disasters, healing of diseases, and it's thought that humans should exercise their free will to promote good and eschew evil. Let's move on to a discussion about divinities. Divinities are worshipped daily, weekly, and annually. They are thought to be God's children, and they serve as God's ministers, servants, and even intermediaries between God and man. Now, it's important to note that in a lot of African religions, worship is directed at the divinities so that it could be received by the larger God. So, worship not directed at larger God, directed at divinities. Got it. Okay, you learned it, and I learned it too. Now, next, after God and the divinities are the spirits, and they could be good or bad. Now, bad spirits are individuals that died a cursed death, so they died by hanging, drowning, and sometimes they can take dimensions and possess animals to affect one's tribe. What I mean by dimensions is they can go from kind of ethereal, transparent, effervescent to voila, two-dimensional, three-dimensional figures in front of your face. Kind of spooky to think about, but nevertheless thought to be true. And then finally, ancestors have special powers in the afterlife and serve as intermediaries between God and the divinities and man. So these ancestors present at tribal gatherings, unseen but felt by family members. Now, it's important to know ancestors are respected, honored, and remembered at family gatherings. Well, talk on, brother. Don't mind if I do. Now, as far as communal solidarity, the religious systems is not about primary benefits to the individual, but the focus is on the community as a whole. So, harmony, cooperation, and solidarity are extremely important. Community celebrations marked by drumming and dancing and singing have religious meanings and serve as a way of bonding members of a community together and affirming one's values. To affirm means to positively express veracity or truthfulness, to positively state what is. Now, in terms of an afterlife, more emphasis is placed on life in this world. There are no beliefs held about a resurrection, a heaven or a hell, or what kind of life will be led about the immortal soul. The main focus is on the here and now. In regard to uh, 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 the soul, there's recognition that the soul is immortal, and upon death, one's soul will return to God and one will give an account of their life. The immortal soul at death will enter the world of spirits. As far as magic, magic is the attempt to influence people or the environment by supernatural means. So, magic objects like amulets, amulets are kind of like charms, talismans, are used to protect one from evil forces such as witchcraft and sorcery. And then finally, West African religion had a moral code that informed life. Moral obligations and responsibilities are provided by the African religion. Misfortunes that befall individuals are thought to be related to a lack of fulfilling moral obligations and requirements, and good fortune is assumed to take place when one takes care of their kinfolk and community. So, this West African religion, some similarities across it. Let's connect it with what we know took place in 1619. So, slavery started in North America when a Dutch ship brought 20 Africans to Virginia, which was a British settlement at the time, struggling to make a profit. White European indentured servants were there working the land, mainly tobacco, cotton, and other crops, but were not really turning a profit. These servants, these indentured servants, would work for 7 years and in return get land and food and keep their rights and return to their native lands, go back across the pond. Now, the kidnapped Africans, some Africans given away, if you will, quotation marks, had no rights according to British rule and were thus treated as chattel once the 7 years were up. So, slavery was legalized in 1641. The colonies became so profitable that in 1660, King Charles II in England transported humans that he called black gold from Africa to America. So about 12.5 million Africans were shipped to the New World during the slave trade, with the vast majority going to the Caribbean, islands like Jamaica, Dominican Republic, Cuba, Haiti, etc., and South America. Only about 390,000 slaves actually made it to American soil, which equates to a relatively small percentage in the grand scheme of the transatlantic slave trade. Uh, England abolished its slave trade in 1807 and January 1807, with a self-sustaining population of over 4 million slaves in the South. Some Southern congressmen joined with the North in voting to abolish the African slave trade, and that act became effective January 1st, 1808. By 1860, a million humans were being moved and sold in the colonies. Now, let's get back to spirituality and religion because we had to get a context. During the colonial period, the spirituality of the slaves was of little interest to white settlers. In the mid to late 1700s and during the 1800s, slave owners began to see value in the slaves being Christianized. These are some of the main reasons why they didn't want them Christianized, but then they begin to see value in them getting Christianized. Now, there's a couple of things that I want to mention in regard to the religious diversity of the Africans that were being transported on these ships, on these boats leaving the West African coastline. 15 to 30% of Africans who were brought to the United States were Muslim. All right, so they had already converted to Islam while they were in Africa. Some Africans had already been exposed to Christianity prior to coming to U.S. Some of the African religions were syncretic, intolerant in nature. So as missionaries came to African soil, what you started to see was some Africans not only adopt their Christian principles, but they also had other traditionally held beliefs according to their tribe that they merged with these Christian beliefs and created a affiliation of sorts. So that's important to keep in mind. Also, there were limited access to copies of the Quran and education in Arabic. The deficit of it, that is, led to a significant decline in observant Muslims. So there were many African slaves who were found praying 5 times a day, who were found reciting passages from the Quran. But over time, if the education isn't in place, if there's no institution to foster that intellectual development, what you start to see happening is that the number of African slaves that are indeed Muslim begins to decline. Okay. So, slave owners use Christianity as a means to keep their enslaved Africans compliant, quiet, and docile. So, big emphasis was placed on an afterlife, even though many Africans did not have much concern about that initially. Given the hardship of the times, one can understand how the afterlife may become appealing. So, so essentially, slave owners manipulating scripture as a means to keep folks oppressed. The Now it's important to also recognize that spirituals were cultivated during these times, shortly after many of the Africans were becoming indeed proselytes or converts. These spirituals oftentimes spoke of freedom and sometimes communicated maps or signals related to escape plans or directions relevant to the Underground Railroad. So Christianity in the person of Jesus served as a unifying symbol for many individuals of African descent. Stories in the Bible connected with the slave narratives and their desires for deliverance, and sometimes these stories even inspired rebellions, such as what you see occur in Southampton, Virginia in 1831, when Nat Turner leads a rebellion. As Christianity is adopted, it's undoubtedly shaped by African religion with community involvement, singing, dancing, worshiping, and praising in secret locations unknown to slave masters. Independent congregations were forming as a result of segregation and Africans being dragged out of churches. So as independent congregations start to crop up by way of freed Africans or individuals that were born free, we start to see that the black church starts to be shaped because of those factors. In these churches, African Americans nevertheless found identities centered on being God's child instead of three-fifths of a person. James Hal Cone, he's worth mentioning here, folks. He's most known for his involvement in liberation theology. Liberation theology is this idea that black churches should be independent from white churches that did not help them in the struggle against racism and oppression. So, given that many emphasize salvation and not necessarily the woes of this life and how to address them, many individuals believe that the black church should split off from these Eurocentric approaches that focus on salvation in the afterlife and establish a new institution, a new theology that specifically deals with black plight. So this black liberation theology put particular emphasis on the marginalized, the downtrodden, and the oppressed, as Jesus did throughout the New Testament. In fact, that served as some of the inspiration for this liberation theology. So the freedom to be all that one is intended to be was emphasized throughout the civil rights period by Martin Luther King Jr., and the black church is thought to be really the only institution owned and controlled by African Americans. I mean, many rely on it for social, economic, political, psychological, and educational support. So, on the slide now, you see an example of how Christian slaveholders justified slavery in the mid to late 1700s and during the 1800s. Slave owners most frequently used Christianity as a means of social control to keep enslaved Africans compliant and docile. This is simply an example of what slave masters and some African Americans and some clergy members would use as a means to keep control of enslaved Africans. So, other ways in which Christian slaveholders justified slavery. Genesis 9 tells a story of Abraham cursing Ham and his sons. In the Bible, Ham finds Noah drunk and naked in Noah's tent. He tells his brothers Shem and Japheth, who proceed to cover their father without gazing at him. Now, when Noah finds out what happened after he sobers up, he curses Ham's son Canaan, and he says that he will be a servant of servants. Now, among the many questions attached to this tale is the following. What did Ham do wrong? Was it looking at his father? Was it telling his brothers? Was it some implied sexual transgression? And why was Canaan, somebody that didn't do anything, cursed for Ham's actions? You know, in the 18th and 19th century Euro America, Genesis chapter 9, 18 to 27 verses, that is, became the curse of Ham, a foundation myth for collective degradation conventionally trotted out as God's reason for condemning generations of dark-skinned people from Africa to slavery. In prior centuries, it seems that Jews, Christians, and Muslims have exploited this story for other purposes. sometimes related to slavery, sometimes related to other peculiar preoccupations. So, in the 1700s, when Africans were converting to Christianity, they would often meet in secret by rivers, lakes, and streams in small houses, oftentimes portable hush houses, as expressed by the scholar Lerone Bennett. These places would be known as hush harbors. It provided a medium in which Africans could reframe their experience in a biblical context, perhaps related to the Exodus story, pray to God, praise and worship God, gather collective strength for tomorrow's troubles, sing spirituals, and be a unified front as people considered survival based on whatever that meant for individuals, attempting an escape, revolting, remaining on the plantation, etc. Call and response was often employed as a means of communicating informative and encouraging messages. Wet rags and water-filled pots would surround the room as a sound barrier, and though dance and song were extremely important and served a spiritual purpose, they were employed carefully or not at all, given the desire to keep the meetings secret. Now, I want you to understand the ironic behavior of the pious slave masters. The ironic behavior of the pious slave masters was observed and experienced by Frederick Douglass and articulated in his autobiography. So, take a moment to pause this video lecture and consider the duality of thought that had to be necessary in order to engage in these heinous practices. So, let's talk about contemporary African American churches. And with that being said, let me also mention that African Americans, they can worship in a temple, mosque, or hall, but most worship in a church. Some African Americans are born into the church and they remain there until they transition out of this life. The church becomes an extended family of sorts, and church life is intermixed with family life. The church provides stability, affirmation, recreational opportunities, learning opportunities, connection to other individuals. Civil rights and political actions are undertaken by some churches, and this sometimes bring a tremendous amount of conflict between prospective members and clergy members, given the nonprofit IRS status of these organizations and how they should politically endorse it. No one. So, though the church can be a positive force in most people's lives, it may also be a source of conflict when it goes against individual values and beliefs. For example, some members, such as LGBTQs, are not always embraced by the church, and this may cause them to leave the black church to have their identity affirmed and causes they believe in supported. So traditionally, churches are ran by male clergy, and women are predominantly the members of these churches. This is interesting given that women are entering seminary at about the same rate as men. In 2015, a research study found that only 8.6% of 4,436 congregations surveyed had a female as their senior leader. Now, many congregants hold on to the biblical writing that the man is the head of the household and thus has to be the head of the church. Despite the statistics, it is anticipated that more women will gain influence in leadership roles in the church. You know, the majority of the African Americans are members of the Christian faith, and this includes Baptist or other Protestant denominations. So most worship is based on God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Trinity. And African Americans consider Jesus as the one who liberates, reconciles, heals, and guides. So clapping, dancing, singing, shouting, these are all ways for African Americans to express themselves spiritually and are linked to cultural forms and styles of worship found in African religions. Testimonials are also a way for one to worship in African American service, and now we're starting to see hip hop music come forth in the church, given the need to appeal to a new generation. There's the expectation when one enters an African American church that they will not leave like they came. In the African American church, the pastor is influential and is called in on good times, weddings, and house blessings, as well as in bad times. So sometimes for funerals. Pastors serve as intermediaries between God and people, and they are extremely influential in setting the agenda for programs and activities. In regard to funerals, funerals support the grief process and are viewed as homegoing celebrations, since the person has returned home to God to be reunited with previously departed loved ones. Celebrations for the deceased came from a period of enslavement where death was seen as freedom and a reason to celebrate, given a belief that the deceased individual's soul returned to his or her native homeland. Hence why some funerals are called homegoing celebrations. Pastor, the pastor usually assures the family that individuals that have passed on will have a good life, and testimonials serve as a means to reflect on the person's good deeds. Now let's talk about the rise of megachurches as we close out this slide. The majority of megachurches were formed after 1980. The black megachurch may have attendance in the number of anywhere between 2,000 to 17,000 individuals. These churches tend to have a variety of programs and ministries that offer a wide range of activities for congregants. Activities include educational ministries, teen ministries, single ministries, couple ministry, health and wellness ministries. So mega churches tend to be led by a charismatic male leader who's usually educated, has a doctorate or a graduate degree, average age of about 49 years old, and has a great deal of guidance and leadership as far as the clergy and the entire body of believers. Black megachurches, they tend to serve similar needs for the suburban middle class as the storefront churches. The storefront churches fulfilled a great deal of needs in the early 20th century, especially when individuals were migrating from the South. And it should be noted that a lot of these black megachurches, they tend to have more civic engagement than the traditional churches. So we've covered a lot of terrain in this presentation. I think right now I will begin to wrap things up by giving you a bird's eye view of the development of the African American or the black church. I'll start by talking about the invisible church, and then I'll move left to right, going up and down. Okay. So the invisible church rose out of a need by enslaved Africans, and it was incubated in the white church when Africans were being Christianized in 1695. It was led by informally uneducated clergy who put together bits and pieces of doctrine that they obtained from white congregations, from their peers that had a little bit more education than them. They took these bits and pieces of doctrine and they put them in Negro spirituals. Now, some liberalized whites also provided a platform in which this new church would form. In other words, they supported the development of this invisible church that was taking place in Hutch Harbors and other secret locations. Now, after the invisible church, right after slave masters decided that hey, there may be something beneficial in converting individuals, and then it backfired in a way they didn't anticipate. After the invisible church, we start to see a stage called the independent institutional church. So this is from the late 1700s and the 1800s. We start to see the institutional church develop. This is when churches were established by what were called quote unquote free Negroes, which typically consisted of children born of free colored persons, mulatto children born of white servants or free women, children of free Negro and Indian parentage, and slaves who were set free. This came out of growing opposition to whites and blacks worshiping together, and there was a great need for an institution to be in place to really reach an illiterate mass of slaves with the gospel message. I mean, after all, there were some people out there with the heart that wanted to touch some of these dehumanized spirits. So during the Great Awakening, 1730s and 1740s, we start to see some of this taking place. Lots of missionaries, specifically preaching to whomever would be open to receiving the gospel message, and that included African slaves, we would see that some of these dehumanized spirits would get touched and ultimately become proselytes. Unfortunately, you still had instances like Richard Allen and Absalom Jones being dragged out of churches, in particular in Philadelphia, 1786, for simply praying in a white person's place. Nevertheless, uh, there was a great support for certain denominations in Christianity, and interest began to emerge in regard to spreading education and really capitalizing on some of the talented free African Americans and ensuring that they would be able to communicate effectively to their population of choice. During this independent institutional church, we also see the development of some of the first historically black colleges and universities, which were initially created to provide individuals with religious study backgrounds or theological underpinnings so that they can serve the needs of their communities. Now, the modern black church, this is from 1900s to the 1960s, rose out of mass migrations of black individuals from the South to the North. So during this time, secularization is seen in the North, and blacks go up north to seek economic opportunities. So the migrations changed the mentality of those reared in traditionally religious places, but unfortunately, as they begin to move to the North, they found that there's a great deal of there's a great lack, excuse me, of no churches in the North in comparison to the South. Families are affected by the mass migrations as women must be more domesticated. Individuals that migrate deal with a lack of skill as a result of being in the South in certain areas. Children exhibit problem behaviors as it relates to the migrations. And you start to see these storefront religious churches crop up in this era of the mass migration of black individuals. The black church during this era begins to reach its climaxing point or its apex with the passing of civil rights legislation in the 1960s. Even during that challenging time, the black church found a way to speak on international and domestic issues of the day, things dealing with war and civil rights, of course. They further developed educational institutions, things that were developed during the independent institutional church era, and more economic opportunities are provided. Now, let's keep moving forward. You still with me, right? Good. So stage four is a part of the modern black church that Dr. Larry Brayboy, he's the one that I believe came up with this model for the development of the black church, believe needs a separate discussion. So this era involves the rise of black liberation theology. So we talked a little bit about that earlier, James Hal Cone, and this need to directly address the black plight, right? So this black liberation theology, it challenges the Eurocentric method of interpretation within the black church. And it arose during a time when blacks were trying to make sense of lynchings and beatings and segregation in the South. So black liberation theology becomes this attempt to reconcile black identity with the scriptures. And other movements, religions, and organizations are also on the rise during this time, such as socially conscious movements like NAACP. You see Garveyism cropping up, you see holiness movements cropping up, and you also see the rise of Islam in the wake of Malcolm X passing. You start to see Muslim Society of America versus Nation of Islam. So you start to see a variety of different orientations as it relates to religion attempting to address the black plight. Finally, stage five. Stage five is the techno-modern church that emerged somewhere around the late 1980s, and that's still where we are today. Many clergy members are concerned that too many distractions that accompany opportunity and upward mobility will cause a brain drain of the brightest and the best, and that will cause the church ultimately to lose out on many individuals that could be influential clergy members due to them pursuing other professions, be it professions in um, legal affairs, professions and educational institutions that don't have anything to do with religious and spiritual matters, finance, etc. So some challenges facing the church include getting a diverse group of individuals together now, because remember, in the invisible, that's funny. In the invisible church, in the independent institutional church, right? Black individuals were essentially very dependent, very reliant on each other, were in close quarters. Then when you start to see more economic opportunity, you start to see mass migration, people aren't concentrated in one environment, but you start to see individuals spread out a great deal. And you start to see them spread out in terms of the different settings they decide to make their home of habitat, be it a suburban area or urban area, rural area, inner city area. You see them spread out in terms of social status, middle class, upper class, lower class, or individuals perhaps below the poverty level. So the Black church now has a great challenge of shortening this broadening gap between the diverse group of Black individuals out there. Secularization and pluralism are also growing, and people no longer accept Christianity at face value like they may have done in the invisible church and the independent institutional church. So it's incumbent upon the Black church now to be extremely theologically sound given the information age. So now we're at a point in time where if the Black church doesn't affirm your values, if they don't support your causes, there are all these other organizations, there's all these other avenues that individuals can become a part of so that they can have their identity affirmed, so that they can have their causes supported. That's a big difference that we're seeing now that we didn't necessarily see in the invisible church and in the independent institutional church. There are also a great deal of individuals not even relying on the brick and mortar church setting, but now that they have technology at their disposal, they're relying on televangelists and their own private study of religious and spiritual affairs to take care of those needs. So those are some of the reasons why a lot of individuals are leaving the Black church, and there are some individuals that tend to remain in the Black church. The individuals that tend to remain in the church are of particular interest to me from a social psychological perspective, because I think that there are some individuals that view their faith as a means to an end. In other words, they're going to church because they're trying to get something out of it, networking. They're trying to get some monetary resources. They're trying to just fix whatever psychological trouble they have and then leave. And then there are some individuals whose faith is the center of their life. There are some individuals who are very quest oriented in regard to faith and ask a whole lot of questions along the existential lines I was talking about earlier. So it's all very interesting and compelling in this age where they say that there's a rise of religious nuns. Anyway, I hope that this presentation was beneficial for you. If you enjoyed it, feel free to pass it along. I'm indebted to so many scholars. These scholars include, of course, Dr. Larry Brayboy. His book was of immense importance, and Dr. Belgrave and Kevin Allison were extremely helpful as I processed a great deal of their literature when putting together this presentation. I look forward to creating more content like this, and I hope to see you back on my channel soon. Take care.